you are joining a conversation where we are in John chapter 4, and we're spending several weeks in this chapter just mining into it and digging into it. And really the context of this story is to understand the heart of Jesus, and this is it for you, is Jesus will do what no one else has done. He will go where no one else will go, to have a conversation that no one else will have, to engage with a person who is so broken that they think no one will talk to them, to equip them with a story that starts a revolution. Some of you need to hear that today, because that's what Jesus will do for you. He will go where no one else goes. He will speak about the things that no one else will speak to you, to give you a story that will unlock cities and bring people to salvation. He does it for her in John chapter 4. He will do it for you. That's his heart towards you, is to empower, to restore, to redeem, to break off shame that holds you back, to break off any limitations, and to give you a purpose and a calling that is beyond everything or beyond anything that you could ever imagine. It's the story of Jesus and the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. I'm not going to recap everything. I encourage you, if you haven't been here, to go back to the last 2 weeks and you'll get the gist of it. But in the middle of this conversation with this woman, Jesus drops some lines which change everything that we know about worship. It's this moment where everything shifts, everything changes, and if we're not careful, if we read over it too quickly, we kind of miss what Jesus is saying and just carry on in the way that we've been. And I think there's no point in coming to sit under the Word of God and leave the same. We've got to have something that comes into our heart and transforms us. And Jesus, he packs this in here, this conversation about worship, and it shifts for all of us, or it should shift the perspective that we have about worship and how we live our lives. Because it affects every single area of our lives, the way that we understand how worship works. You see, for many of us, we have this idea that worship is this moment that we just had on Sunday. Like right at the end there, that was worship. The first song, that was new, that was cool, but that was like a praise song. But towards the end, we could feel it. Like it was getting warm in the room, and that's because the doors were closed. Or was God doing something? I don't know. Like, please open those doors, let the air in here. And okay, we're feeling now worship is coming. There's something happening inside. It's worship. It's worship. We lift our hands. It's worship. It's worship. Or it's we used to have those CDs. Now that's what we call worship. Some of you remember those things. Is that worship? Like, what is this thing of worship? Let me tell you what worship is not. Worship is not the slow songs that we sing on Sunday. Okay. It's not the opposite of the praise songs. That's an expression of worship. Worship is not coming to church on a Sunday. That's an expression of worship. Worship is not bowing down before something. That's an expression of worship. What worship is, way before it's an action, is an internal attitude of the heart. It's a posture of your heart towards something, towards a person, or towards an object. Worship is what you give worth to. It's what you esteem, what you value. It's the area in your life where you are not stingy. That's worship. And your behavior can lead you to the object of your worship. If this is speaking to you, I want to, and if you're a reader, I would encourage you to get this book by Lamar Boschman. It's called Authentic, or Authentic Worship. You can get it on Scribd. It's an easy read. It's profound. It's helped shape a lot of my thinking as I've been digging into this, and I would encourage you to get it and to read through that. But a lot of what he speaks about there is kind of what we feel like God is stirring in our hearts, is learning how to be better worshipers. Because if Jesus changes everything about worship, and we have this preconceived idea of what worship is, but Jesus changes everything, I want to be one who understands like how he's changed it and how to be a better worshiper, because I don't want to get worship wrong. Because here's the danger, is you can come to church on a Sunday, you can gather, you can sing the songs, and you can do all of that without actually worshiping. Because you think, well, this is worship. And I've been to church, I've sung the songs, but have you worshipped? I want to grapple with this and understand what worship is. And it's not a new conversation. In fact, right in the pages of the New Testament, this guy called Paul, who wrote a lot of the New Testament that we have, he went on this like missionary tour, and he ended up in Athens. And if you know anything about the Greeks, they had all kinds of gods, and a lot of that is still in the movies that we watch today, the influence of that. And he takes a tour through their city, and I'm going to start in Acts chapter 17 and read you a couple of verses. Paul stood in the middle of the Areopagus, and he said, "People of Athens, I see that you are extremely religious in every respect. For as I was passing through and observing the objects of your worship." In other words, he's cruising the streets of Athens, he's looking around, and he's seeing all these shrines and all these idols. And if he were here today in our city, he would walk around and he would probably see the shopping malls and the sports stadiums and look at the objects of our worship. And he says, I even found an altar on which it was inscribed to an unknown God. So like, okay, these ones we know about, so we'll worship them, but like there's some other stuff which we really cannot explain. So what we're going to do is just build an altar and call that to the unknown God. Like, you know, just in case, because we don't want to get worship wrong. So they have this shrine to the unknown God. And then Paul says, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it. This is a very, very provocative statement to the Greeks. To the God who made the world and everything in it. He is the Lord of heaven and earth. He does not live in shrines made by hands. In other words, he's not limited to be an idol. See, sometimes I hear the word idol and I think of like the stone statue or a totem pole or something. I don't know what you think or I don't know what you think of. What do you think of when you hear idols? Pop idols or something. You know what the root word of the word idol is? Worthless. Interesting. This is my idol. He's my idol. She's my idol. She's worthless. He's worthless. That's what you're proclaiming. That's what it means. Go look where the word comes from. It means worthless. Idols are things that man have made, and then we make them, we form them, and then they form us. And idolatry, this is why God is so serious about idolatry, because he knows idolatry will wreck your life. Because it will never fulfill or satisfy, and it'll keep you going back for more. And it's very difficult to live in a place where you're just not quite satisfied. And that's what idolatry does. This is what Paul is addressing. He carries on speaking about God. He said, he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. You know, sometimes we think God needs something. But God really needs my help. Paul said, God doesn't need your help, but he invites you to partner with him in the case. Since he himself gives everyone life and breath and all things, from one man he's made every nationality to live over the whole earth, and he's determined their appointed times and the boundaries of where they live. He did this so that they might seek God, and perhaps they might reach out and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. I love this verse. For in him we live, in him we move, in him we have our being. What he's declaring is an absolute truth of this created God. And really what he's saying is that you have been made by God. You've been created to worship. You've been called to worship. In fact, you're commanded to worship. You're instructed to worship. You're redeemed by Jesus' work on the cross to worship, to be a worshiper. And to worship is to know and be known by God. It's to have a relationship with him. And this is what Jesus changed in this text that we're going to get to in a moment. He took worship from out there and brought it to in here. Worship is very difficult to define. It's way more of a mystery than it is a formula or a mechanical action. It's way more of a heart attitude. But I thought it would be helpful if we can create a worship map. So something, when you think about worship, to give you three ideas, 3 thoughts about worship, to maybe change the way that you think about worship. So I want to share these with you, and hopefully it'll become for you a kind of map to keep you on track with worship. So you can answer the question, am I actually worshiping? If you were to take off the cover of your worship, whatever that is, what is it that's under there? Is it worship? Can you with confidence say, I am a worshiper of God, or I am a worshiper of something else? So let's go to John chapter 4, and we're going to recap. We'll read today in the Message. We read it last time in a different version. Just a couple of verses from here again. This is the conversation where everything changes. Jesus talking to this woman at the well. And she's getting a little bit up in his face because he's just called her out on not having a husband, living with someone else. So he's basically confronting the sin, but not in a judgmental way, in an extremely graceful and intentional way. But she kind of begins to evade, and she says, oh, so you're a prophet. Well, tell me this. Our ancestors, they worshiped God at this mountain, but you Jews, you insist that we must worship over there because Jerusalem is the only place for worship, right? That's what you say. So our forefathers say we must worship there, but the Jews say we must worship there. So Jesus, prophet man, tell me, where should we worship? It's very dangerous to ask Jesus a question. Jesus responds. He says, believe me, woman, the time is coming when you Samaritans will worship the Father neither here at this mountain nor there in Jerusalem. You worship guessing in the dark, but we Jews, we worship in the clear light of day. God's way of salvation is made available through the Jews, but the time is coming, in fact, it is already here, when what you're called will not matter, and where you go to worship will not matter. but it's who you are and the way that you live that count before God. Your worship must engage your spirit in the pursuit of truth. That's the kind of people that the Father is looking out for. Those who are simply and honestly themselves before Him in their worship. God is sheer being itself, spirit. So those who worship must do it out of their very being, out of their spirits, their true selves in adoration. And in these verses, Jesus unpacks what the picture of worship is. It's something that happens spirit to spirit. It's something that's organic, authentic. It comes out of you, and it's an expression and adoration towards God, to the Spirit of God. So a worship map, I'll give you 3 thoughts around these things. Worship is like marriage. Worship has to do with authority, and worship has to do with presence. Map. You guys, we're tracking this morning. Marriage, authority, presence. M.A.P, a worship map. Worship is like marriage. Some of you are not married, so you have to try to imagine with me. We're going to help you a little bit here this morning. A well in ancient times was where you would go to find a wife. So in the mornings and in the evenings, the ladies of the city would go to draw water, and the men, the bachelors, would come out and engage in conversation with the ladies at the well, hoping to get hitched at the well. It's no coincidence that Jesus goes to a well in the middle of the day and meets this woman who has a sketchy history when it comes to relationships. And Jesus says, you've had 5 husbands, and the one you're living with now is not your husband. So things are not going well for her on the relationship front. But sometimes we can be quick to judge her and go, like, this woman must be really messed up. Or could it be that the men have actually messed her up? And she's a victim, and she's been mistreated. And I think it's more likely the latter. And Jesus engages her at a well. And really what he's doing in this conversation about worship is he's giving her an invitation into a relationship which is just like a marriage covenant. So you see, nothing is by accident in the Bible. Everything is intentional. Even the geographic location of where Jesus has this conversation. It's the setup for a marriage relationship beginning. And Jesus goes to this broken woman and gives her, if I can say it this way, a marriage proposal. Not that her and Jesus are going to get married on the spot and go off and start a family, but in the sense that he's inviting her into a bigger story where she's coming from a broken relationship, a place of shame, and he's saying, I'm inviting you into something of relationship where there is covenant and there's commitment and there's intimacy and there's authenticity, and we can be real and we don't have to be pretending. Because that's what marriage is. It's a place where there's intimacy and authenticity, and you can be real and you can drop your guard. This is the picture that Jesus is giving of what worship is in spirit and truth. In other words, with your heart, with your mind, with your soul, with everything that you have, real, authentic in this covenant. This is what worship is like. You see, in the Old Testament, worship used to be over there on that mountain or over there in the temple in Jerusalem. And what Jesus does, he says, worship is moving from a place into a person. The temple is not going to be a building, but in fact, you yourselves will be the temple, and the Holy Spirit is going to move into your life. So all of you that follow Jesus are like little temples that go around, which means you can worship wherever you go. You don't have to go somewhere to worship, but you can just begin to worship and be yourself in spirit and truth before God wherever you are. And the thing about marriage is marriage doesn't just happen. Life happens. And some of my friends have had to help me understand this, because this doesn't happen in our relationship, but in their relationships. I understand it to be like this, is that life gets busy. And you start to miss each other. And you end up as a married couple being 2 people that live in the same house, but you kind of forget the first love that you had. And you know, the thing that, your first love that attracted you to the person in the beginning, I mean, this is what they say, in the beginning, and then years later, that very thing which attracted you suddenly becomes the thing which frustrates you. I mean, in the beginning, she can be like, oh, I just love it how he loves to have so much fun all the time. And then years later, it's like, I just wish he'd be serious for a moment. Or it's so cute that she leaves her shoes all over the place. And in the end, you're just like, I wish you'd just put her shoes in the cupboard.
I'm working on it, okay?
And the thing is that life happens and we get busy, but marriage doesn't just happen. And those of you who've been married, who are married, you know that marriage takes intentionality and it takes work. And if you don't pay attention to your marriage, what happens is barriers grow between you over time, and suddenly the person that you used to be so close to seems so distant and cold, and you begin to drift apart. So if worship is like a marriage, I want to say to you, how's your marriage doing? Or has life just got busy? Life happens. The marriage doesn't happen. You have to work at it. Life happens, but worship, it requires some intentionality. And you, my friends, you are created to worship. You are created to worship extravagantly with everything in you, emotionally, with your heart, with your mind, with your soul, with your very being, and expressively, whatever that means to you. That is how God has created you. It's no significance that Jesus goes to a well. And I was thinking in this week, I wonder if this is where the saying comes from, you're a tall drink of water. Could it be here? Could it be John 4? I don't know, that joke. Lamar Boschman, from the book that I mentioned, he said, I'd rather my heart be without words than my words without hearts. Now, how often do we stand before God and we say words that don't have heart in them? God, let my heart be without words, then rather my words be empty and without heart to you. This is what worship is. Worship is like marriage. Worship it has to do with authority. If you flip to the end of your Bible and you look through the pages, Revelation, there's a vision that the Apostle John has about worship in heaven. That's like a template to look like what worship is going to be like one day. And in the center of worship is the throne of God, is the Lamb and the throne. So the throne is the center of worship. There's a Psalm 22, verse 3. It says, God, you are enthroned on the praises of the people. Enthroned it means to put someone on the throne. So wherever the people worship, wherever the people praise God, that's where he is enthroned. So worship is connected to authority. When you begin to worship God, what happens is you put him on the throne in that area of your life. And when God's on the throne, then as king, his rule and reign comes. And his kingdom, his will is good, pleasing, and perfect. It's righteousness, peace, and joy. So when you begin to worship, what you're doing is you're saying God is in charge in this place, in this space. As Jesus says, worship is not on the mountain over there or in the temple over here, but it's in your heart. What he's saying, to quote Tom Inglis, he says, your worship is not subject to a geography, but geography is subject to your worship. You don't have to go to a certain place to worship. You don't have to go there or you don't have to go there. But when you begin to worship in the place that you are, something's going to change because you're declaring an authority of who's in charge in this area, in this circumstance. So if you want to see some change in your life, what you've got to do is to learn to exercise the authority on which you operate. And many of us, what we have is we have like our authority that Jesus has given us written down, but it's in our back pocket. Let me tell you something. The enemy, he's not afraid of the slow songs that we sing here on a Sunday. Nothing against slow songs. Love them. He's not afraid of them. What he's afraid of is the authority that we carry around with us, but we don't use. So this week, my youngest son, Joel, he had his first tag rugby tournament. It was yesterday. And as it goes with school things, is you go to the first practice and then you realize there's a lot more kids than there are coaches. And then comes the ask. It's like, hey, we'd love it if some more dads, got involved. So there I am. I'm on the field. And the next thing I'm on the WhatsApp group. And then a message comes and it's like, hey, just write this exam. It's tonight, but it's easy. So I go on I do the exam and I pass the exam and then I get an email that says, you are now a certified coach. And then the WhatsApp group message comes, like, see you on Saturday, 30 minutes before the game. And I get there, and the other coach is not there yet. So there I am. The kids are there, and they look at me, and they're little, 5 and 6 years old. So it's just, it's chaos. And anyway, it turned out well, and it was fun, and all those things. The other coach eventually arrived. But what I realized that I was thinking about today is, hey, you know what? I had that certificate on my phone in my pocket. I had the authority. I had it. I passed the exam. I've been to the practice. I am a tag rugby coach. I am. I have the authority. But let me tell you what didn't happen is when I walked onto the field, the kids didn't say to each other, oh my goodness, that's the guy with the coaching certificate in his pocket. Let's pay attention to him. No, it was only when I stood upon that authority and stood up in front of them and said, hey kids, I'm the coach, 1, 2, 3, eyes on me. All of a sudden the atmosphere changed and they lined up and suddenly they engaged and focused. When it comes to your worship, you have the authority in your pocket with you. But what you do is you walk around and you just expect that things are going to change because you haven't declared the authority that you have. But a time should come, in fact, is here now when you pull out the authority that you have and you say, I'm going to walk into this situation, this boardroom, this circumstance, this school, this place, and I'm going to begin to worship because when I worship, the circumstance is going to change. You are commanded to worship. Not because God needs your worship, but because He knows when you worship, geography is subject to your worship. Your worship is not subject to geography. So if you want to see a change in your life, this is what you got to do. Begin to worship. Because when you worship, you declare, Jesus is on the throne. I stand upon His authority. His rule and reign comes in this place. If we want to see revival come, and we're serious about the words that we sing, what we got to do is learn how to be worshipers. Not learn how to worship, but to have a heart of worship that stands upon the authority that God has for us. Ken Costa, he said, your workstation is your worship station. Your workstation is your worship. That doesn't mean that you go to work and you worship your work, but at your workstation at work, it's in that place that you can worship. Worship is not restricted to our moments and times here on a Sunday. No, but worship is wherever you go. Isn't that just so incredible and so powerful? Is this a mind shift for you, or is it just me? Where you go like, hey, if I want to see change in my life, all I got to do is start worshiping God wherever I go. And when I worship, things are going to change because the rule and reign of God is going to come. And His rule and reign is good, pleasing, perfect, righteousness, peace, joy. Battling with anxiety, begin to worship. Battling with a difficult situation, colleague at work, begin to worship and watch the things change in your life. You see, you begin to worship from the inside and the things on the outside begin to change. You are commanded to worship despite your circumstances. Worship has to do with marriage, worship has to do with authority, and worship has to do with presence. Jack Hayford said, worship is about encounter, coming into the presence of God. And sometimes we say that in church, we're like, yo, you could just feel God's presence. And you're new to church, you're like, these people are weird. What are they talking? How do you know what it feels like? Is it goosebumps? Is it like, are there tears? Like, what happens when it's the presence of God? How do you know? How can you just say, this is the presence of God? So if worship is about encounter and coming into God's presence, like, how do we understand? Because isn't God everywhere? I mean, we understand that. Like, God is everywhere. In fact, I think there's a psalm somewhere in there that says, there's nowhere that I can go to escape from your presence. So if God's presence is everywhere, how do we enter into His presence? Because aren't we already in His presence? And it's a great question. But I was thinking about how you sit sometimes on a winter afternoon. I know summer's finished now. We're into autumn and winter's coming. But here's something to look forward to. As you sit in a winter afternoon in your house in the beautiful air of Gauteng where we are. And in the air, there's all these things, right? There's these dust particles and like smoke particles, all these things, but you can't see them all the time until you're sitting in your lounge and you suddenly see a sunbeam come and it catches all the particles. And you look and you go like, wow, look how beautiful that is. The benefits of living in Gauteng. This is what it's like with the presence of God, is those particles were always there, but it just took something to let you see that they're there. This is what worship does for us. God is everywhere. We can't escape from His presence. But entering into His presence has way more to do with what we see than where God is. He's already here. And what worship does is it draws us into an experience of His presence. And in His presence is things like delight and peace and fullness of joy and everlasting freedom. It's like all these good things in His presence. And this word presence in the Old Testament, what it really means is face. So when you say, I'm coming into the presence of God, what it means is, I'm getting into God's face. That's what it means. So I'm coming into a face of, anyone battle with personal space boundaries? You know, you go to some countries around the world and they just don't have that issue. And they're like, but worship is about coming face to face with God. So how do we do that? Well, there's a key, there's a treasure hidden in Psalm 100. And it says, on your feet now, applaud God, bring a gift of laughter, sing yourselves into his presence. So God is everywhere. But how do we see it? How do we experience it? Well, it says, well, sing yourself into his presence. Know this, God is God, and God. He made us, and we didn't make him. We're his people, his well-tended sheep. And here it is. Enter with the password. Thank you. Make yourselves at home, talking praise. Thank him, worship him, for God is sheer beauty, all generous in love, loyal, always and forever. Do you remember as kids, where you'd be the one locked out of a door, and there'll be someone holding the door behind you, and you're like, knock, let me in. They're like, tell me the secret password. And you're like guessing what it is. Can be a bit like worship for us with this. We feel like we're locked out of something. We're going, God, what's the secret password to worship? And here it is in Psalm 100. It's say thank you. Gratitude unlocks the doors into the presence of God. When our heart's attitude towards God is grateful and worshipful towards him despite our circumstances, but because, and here's the thing, this I didn't plan to say this, but you can always go back to this. If you want to judge the goodness of God, judge it by Jesus on the cross, not by your current circumstances. If you ever question, is God good? Look at Jesus on the cross. Don't look at the circumstances around you, because the circumstances around you can change with the worship. So in some ways, you have to take responsibility for some of the circumstances that you're in. Some of them have happened to you, and God can see you through them, like he did for the woman in John 4. Some of them is of your own doing. You can change that with worship. But if you want to know about the goodness of God, look at Jesus on the cross, the one who gave his life for you. And from that place, his gratitude springs forth. You say, even though I'm broken, even though I'm a sinner, Jesus, you gave your life for me. You empower me with your spirit. You want to give me freedom and a purpose. I'm grateful. And when your heart is in that place of gratitude, what happens is something begins to come up inside of you that you can't quite explain. I don't know if someone has ever been so kind to you or given you something that you battle to get words out. If you can think of a moment in your life, or maybe someone gave you a gift or did something for you, and you're just like, you cannot believe, you cannot find words and you just start like blubbering. There's a word for this in the Bible. It's a Hebrew word. It's called tahila. Tahila. And what this means, it's a spontaneous song that comes out of your spirit. There's two types of words that we find in the Old Testament, halal praise and tahila praise. Halal praise is like going through the motions. It's like when you start a diesel engine on a cold winter's morning, it like gets you going. Halal is kind of like sometimes that first song that we sing on a cold winter's morning. It's like, but it gets the engine going, and we warm up, and what we're aiming for is to reach a place of tahila praise. And suddenly something shifts inside your spirit, and you begin to overflow with something you don't quite know where it comes from. But where it comes from is you're getting into the face of God because you enter in with the attitude, sounds cheesy, attitude of gratitude. It unlocks the door into the presence of God. So how do we get there? Well, you got to practice this. So we're going to practice it now. You're redeemed to worship. If you walked in here and you're wondering about God's goodness to you because of something that's going on in your life or something that's happened to you, I'm sorry to tell you, in fact, sorry, not sorry, the New Testament is a story of suffering. Following Jesus is full of trial and suffering. So where do we find the goodness of God? We look at the story of what Jesus has done for us, and in that we find strength and encouragement to move forward, and we understand that God is taking this world somewhere to a place of healing and redemption and wholeness, and we're part of that story. And that's where we come back to find our gratitude, to enter into his presence. When we begin to worship in spirit and truth with this heart full of gratitude towards him, something comes up in us and it takes us into his presence, and we come into the face of God. And this all goes back to Genesis chapter 3. You know that crazy story about Adam and Eve in the garden and the talking snake and all those things. In the beginning, they were in the presence of God, in the face of God. And then something happened. Sin entered their lives, and it shattered that relationship. And when God came walking in the garden, he asked them, like, where are you? I mean, seriously, hide and seek with God? But he asked, where are you? More to get themselves to see where they are. And they're kind of hiding in the bushes. I wonder if God can see us. And it wasn't that he didn't know where they were, but they had taken themselves away from the face of God. And the invitation that we have in worship and to become worshipers is to be restored into the presence of God, to come face to face with him again. This is the work of Jesus on the cross, that he's removed the barriers. And we've got to act upon that authority and step into the place of worship. There can be some barriers in our lives that hold us back from that. Just like there are barriers when you drift apart in a marriage, and over time there's walls that are built up. And these are some of the barriers. You can have sin in your life that you know God is speaking to you about and confronting, but you're tolerating it. And then what happens, because you've got that, you're tolerating that in your life, you don't feel worthy to go into the presence of God, so you don't press into the presence of God. And you're like Adam and Eve, and you hide from his presence. And the way to deal with that is to confess it before God and say, God, I repent of this. I want to come into your presence. And you lay it down before him. You may have other things in your life that are taking your priority, focus, attention, and that has become the focus of your worship. And you're wondering, why am I missing the presence of God? Well, maybe there's something else. Maybe there's an idol there that needs to be taken off a throne, and you put Jesus back on the throne so you come into the presence of God.